The drill had been screaming for 11 hours when the signal came. Maren Voss heard it first. She always heard things first, a side effect, she'd decided, of spending 14 months on Rig Halcyon, with nothing but the North Sea and the low diesel-throated moan of machinery for company. Her ears had recalibrated to a world without crowds, a world without traffic, a world without the ordinary noise of other people existing nearby. So when the transmission started bleeding through on the emergency band at 0347 on a Tuesday morning in November, she was already awake, already sitting in the radio shack with a mug of something that used to be coffee, already listening. It was not a human voice. She sat with the headset pressed against one ear and the other palm flat on the console, feeling the vibration of the rig's heart through her skin. Outside, the sea was doing what the North Sea always did, building itself into something slow and gray and immovable, rolling under the platform legs with the dull patience of a thing that has outlasted everything before and expected to outlast everything after. The drill kept screaming. The indicator lights ran their yellow-green cycle. The coffee had gone cold without her noticing. The signal was a tone, then a pattern, then something that wasn't quite either. She recorded it, she played it back, she recorded it again. She sat for a long time with her hand on the headset and the recording running in a loop and the cold coffee in the other hand, and she thought about the things she'd seen in the sky this past week. The objects that moved in patterns no satellite moved. The lights that persisted too long and too steady to be meteors, too slow to be any aircraft she knew. She had noticed them 3 nights ago and had not said anything to anybody. Not because she doubted what she was seeing, but because some moments require a little time before they can be spoken, before the shape of them has resolved enough to survive being put into words. Then she went to wake Dr. Okafor, because that was what you did when the universe said something, and you weren't sure what language it was speaking. Bernard Okafor had been a xenolinguist for 22 years before there was anything to apply xenolinguistics to. He'd published 6 papers and been politely mocked at 3 conferences, and had spent the better part of a decade arguing that the field deserved to exist before the thing arrived to prove him right. He did not feel vindicated. Vindication requires leisure, and he was no longer in a position to feel leisurely about anything. He sat in the radio shack with Maren's headset on and listened to the signal for 4 minutes without moving. She watched him listen. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, the specific unfocused gaze of someone who is processing something much larger than their eyes can frame. "That's not random noise," he said. "I know," Maren said, "and it's not any band I've ever heard used for, I know." He took the headset off very carefully, the way you set down a glass you're not sure is full. He set it on the console. He looked at the waveform display, at the repeating pattern that her recording equipment had caught and played back, and that the analysis software had flagged, in its neutral algorithmic language, as high-probability structured communication, as if the software had been waiting its whole operational life to flag exactly this thing, and was now being scrupulously professional about it. "How long has it been transmitting?" 40 minutes before I woke you. Maybe longer. I wasn't watching the board until..." She stopped. "I wasn't sleeping well." He understood. Nobody on Halcyon slept well. The rig worked even when the workers didn't, and its rhythms were not human rhythms. But he also understood that she had been awake at 03:47 listening to the emergency band for reasons that had nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with the night sky, which had been doing something strange for the past week. They had all noticed. Nobody had said it out loud. "We need to log this," he said. "I already did. We need to report it." She handed him the satellite phone. The line to Aberdeen was dead. The line to the coastal relay station at Stavanger was a wall of static. The line to the emergency marine band was functioning. But the emergency marine band was already carrying something. Many somethings. Voices overlapping in 4 languages at least, all carrying the same frequency of sound, the particular pitch that human voices reach when what's happening exceeds the vocabulary available to describe it. Bernard Okafor set the phone down next to the headset. "All right," he said. He picked up his pen because he was that kind of man, the kind who takes with a pen even when the world is ending, especially when the world is ending. He clicked it 3 times. A habit, a tick, something his graduate students had used to mock him for behind his back. He opened his notebook. "Let's figure out what they're saying." They worked through the rest of the night. Bernard at the console, Maren beside him with a fresh cup of coffee she actually drank this time. The signal had structure, a repeating element that served as anchor. variations that clustered around it, the basic grammar of something that wanted to be understood. Bernard had 2 decades of theoretical work to bring to this, and he brought it with a focused intensity that she found, under the circumstances, enormously comforting. There was something in watching someone do their life's work that was steadying, even when the life's work was this. By 05:15 they had fragments. By 06:30 they had enough fragments to know the shape of the message, even without its full meaning. By then the sky was beginning to change. They appeared at dawn, not with fire, not with the kind of arrival that Marin had spent 37 years absorbing from films and books, and the collective imagination of a species that had been dreaming about this moment since it first looked up. There were no columns of light burning through cloud cover, no bass register thunder that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears, no shadow falling across the sun. They simply descended the way snow descends or fog, gradually present, then fully present, then undeniably present. 6 of them at first, then 12, then a number that defeated casual counting. They came out of the overcast sky above the North Sea, and they hung there, roughly 200 meters above the water, roughly 500 meters from Rig Halcyon, and they did nothing for a very long time. Marin stood on the outer deck and looked at them. The cold was hitting her face and the wind was hitting her face, and neither registered. They were not the shapes she'd expected. Science fiction had provided templates, angular, metallic, the geometric severity of things built to cross distance. These were none of that. They had the quality of living things, asymmetrical, lightly textured, the way a school of fish has form without having fixed form. They reflected the gray morning light the way wet stone reflects it, and they were quiet, utterly, completely quiet. The entire North Sea seemed to have gone quiet under them, the way a forest goes quiet when something large has entered it. Behind her, the rig's crew had gathered on the deck. 12 people in total, the skeleton maintenance team that winter operations required. Some of them had their phones out, which struck her in a distant way as the most human response possible. Document first, understand later. Tomas from the repair crew was holding a cup of tea. He'd made himself a cup of tea. He'd walked up here with a cup of tea, and he was standing there drinking it, watching the sky, with the same expression he'd worn when she'd once seen him watch a particularly large wave approaching from the west. Not afraid exactly, but attending. Paying the respect of full attention. Are they? One of the younger engineers started. Yes, Marin said. Are they? I think so. She felt Bernard at her shoulder before she heard him. He stood beside her with his notebook open, and he was looking at the floating shapes, and his pen was hovering above the page, waiting the way a conductor's baton waits before the downbeat. Then one of them descended further, alone, separating from the group the way a single word separates from a sentence. It came down slowly, still that same snowfall quality. No engine sound, no displaced air, and it stopped at deck level, about 20 meters off the starboard rail. And it simply hung there, eye level with them, and they looked at it and it looked at them. Though what constituted looking was not yet apparent. It was roughly the size and shape of a large dog. It had fur the color of deep water in winter, a blue-black with green undertones that shifted as the light caught different angles of it. The fur moved slightly in the sea wind. It had no visible face in the human sense, no mouth, no nose, but in its front-facing surface were 2 structures that Marin's brain, casting about desperately for reference, filed as eyes, wide, amber, with a quality of attention in them that was unmistakable. It was looking at them. It was thinking about them. The quality of its attention was different from anything she'd encountered before. Not the attention of a predator, which has a specific kind of edge to it, a compression of focus. Not the attention of a camera, which records without considering. This was the attention of something that was working through a complex problem and had not yet arrived at an answer, and the problem was them. There was a long silence, the kind of silence that has weight. Then Bernard Okafor cleared his throat and said, in a voice that was considerably steadier than it had any right to be, "Good morning." The creature, the being, the alien, regarded him. The amber structures shifted. Something in the texture of the fur changed, a ripple passing through it, the way a ripple passes through water when something below it moves. And then, in a voice that came from somewhere within it that was not a mouth, a voice that was less sound than it was pressure, a vibration at the lower edge of audible frequency that assembled itself barely into human language, it said, "You should not be here." Bernard clicked his pen once. "This is a drilling platform," he said. "We more or less have to be here." The amber structures shifted again. The fur's ripple changed pattern, slower, different in some way that Marin could feel before she could name. "You should not be here," it said again, and she understood this time that it was not a statement about the rig. "Your species, on this world, in its present condition." The pressure voice was flat, not cruel, not satisfied, simply stating, "You have been assessed." Behind her, she heard one of the crew exhale slowly, the sound of someone setting something down inside themselves. "Assessed," Bernard said. "On what basis?" The amber structures settled on him. "Your own records, our own, the information you have been broadcasting for decades. The measurements, the data, the projections. You documented your own destruction and broadcast it into space. We received it, we read it, we translated it. It took us some time." A pause, the fur rippled. "You are not, as a species, difficult to translate. You repeat yourselves considerably." Bernard clicked his pen, and the sentence, he said, was decided based on that information. "Yes." Without speaking to us. Another pause, longer. The fleet above them made no sound and no movement. What would speaking to you have changed? It was not a rhetorical question, Marin understood. It was a genuine one. The being was asking it the way you ask a question, when you already believe you know the answer but have encountered something that makes you slightly less certain than you were a moment ago. Marin said, "We don't know. We've never done it before." The amber structures settled on her. "You," it said, "are not the one I was listening to." "No," she said, "but I was the one listening to you at 3 in the morning before anyone else was awake. I heard you come in." She crossed her arms against the cold. "That means something, doesn't it? In your culture, whatever you have for culture. Doesn't the fact that someone was listening mean something?" The fur rippled again. Longer, this time. A different pattern. "You were broadcasting," it said. "Before we arrived, we intercepted it." "What were we broadcasting?" "Your signal. The regular transmissions from this structure." But also it paused. The pause had a different quality to it now. Less calculation and more something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet. "You were transmitting on an unusual frequency. A personal one. A human one. Not addressed it to anyone." Marin felt something drop in her chest. The personal frequency. The things she did some nights when the isolation got to a certain weight. When 14 months of nothing but the sea and the machinery and the small familiar faces of the crew pressed on her in a way she couldn't move through. She'd sit in the radio shack and she'd broadcast into empty space. Not words, usually. Sometimes words. Sometimes just the sound of her voice, the shape of it, the proof that it existed. Once she'd read the entirety of a letter she'd never sent to her father, who died 4 years ago, broadcasted into the North Sea night on a frequency nobody monitored, because it felt like putting something into the world that the world had taken out. Not for anyone to hear, for the act of transmitting, which was its own form of unburdening. "What was I transmitting?" she said carefully. "The night you intercepted it. You were saying," the alien said, and its voice dropped further into a register that was almost below human hearing, "that you were grateful. You said it to no one. You listed things, small things, a meal, a particular quality of light on the water, a song, the fact that your colleague." The amber structures shifted briefly toward Bernard, told a joke that made you laugh until you had to sit down. It paused. "You ended by saying, 'Thank you,' to no one, to the empty air." The wind moved between them. "You do that often," it said. "Humans. We have observed it. Gratitude transmitted into the void. Thanks given to nothing, to no one." Another ripple, slower. "We had not modeled this variable. In our assessment, it appeared in the personal communication records, the private exchanges, the unsent letters, the spoken words directed at the already dead, the prayers to things that do not answer. It appeared throughout your data as a persistent and recurring behavior that served no identifiable function in the survival or social framework of your species. We classified it as noise." The amber eyes were very still. "And then we found your transmission, and we kept returning to it. In the course of our journey here, we could not place it in our taxonomy." "What purpose does any feeling serve," Marin said, "in the behavioral economy of anything?" Sev was quiet for a long time. Then, very slowly, it descended the last 2 meters and settled on the deck railing. What happened in the next 6 hours was less a negotiation than it was a conversation, and less a conversation than it was something that didn't have a clean name in either language. Sev sat on the railing, just sat there, fur moving in the wind, 12 humans arranged in a loose arc at what they decided was a respectful distance, somewhere between 3 meters and 5. And it talked, and they talked, and the talking went somewhere that none of them had planned to go. The others, the fleet, the cloud of them still hanging above the water, did not descend. They waited. Marin kept watching them in her peripheral vision, checking whether the formation had changed, whether they had moved closer. They hadn't. They were simply there, the way a fact is simply there once you know it, present in the corner of every thought. Tomas had gone back inside and returned with more tea. He'd made enough for everyone, including, and this was the gesture Marin thought about afterward more than anything else, a cup that he set on the railing near Sev. He didn't say anything. He just put it there, a mug of black tea, steaming slightly in the cold morning air, set on the railing of a drilling platform in the North Sea, next to a creature from another part of the universe that had come to end the world. Sev looked at it for a long time. "What is it?" it said. "Tea," Thomas said. "It's hot." He paused, seemingly realizing there was no version of this explanation that was going to be fully adequate. "It helps. When things are," he gestured at the sky, at the fleet, at the general situation. "When things are a lot, it helps." Sev reached out one of its limb structures, the tentative extension of something not quite a hand, and touched the outside of the mug. It held the touch. The fur along its front changed color slightly, darkening, in a way that Bernard, who had been writing furiously this whole time, later theorized was a thermal response analog. "Comfort received through heat. Your species," Sev said after a moment, "has been destroying this world for 200 of your years in accelerating fashion." "Yes," Bernard said, "the harm is documented. The trajectory is established." "Yes, and yet," Sev did not remove its limb from the mug, "you also do this. You make warmth and give it to each other, including to things that have come to destroy you." It paused. "We had not modeled this variable. We're inconsistent," Marin said. "We're the most inconsistent things in our own data. We know what we're doing wrong, and we do it anyway. We know what we should do instead, and we fail at it constantly. We're terrible at being what we know we could be." She wrapped both hands around her own mug. "But we also do this. We keep doing this, even knowing everything. Why?" She thought about her father, about the letter she'd broadcast into the void, about the fact that broadcasting it had, somehow, made the weight of it slightly more bearable, not gone, not resolved, but shared with the empty air, and therefore slightly lighter. "Because the alternative," she said, "is to stop. And we don't stop. We're not built to stop. That's the thing about us. We know we're damaged and we don't stop. We know we're failing and we don't stop. We fall apart and we get back up and we get it wrong again and we..." She looked at the fleet above the water. "We make tea, we broadcast into the dark. We say thank you to nothing, we don't stop." The fur rippled the whole surface of Sev's body, slowly, in a wave that traveled from front to back and then back to front. "This is irrational," it said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is also," Sev said, and something in its voice dropped again, into that almost below-hearing frequency. "What we came here without. What our assessment did not account for. What none of our models included." It was quiet for a moment. "We do not have this. Our species reaches conclusions and enacts them. There is no falling apart. There is no getting back up. There is no redundancy of hope in the face of evidence." It touched the mug again. "We have never." It stopped. The fur went still. "We lost a world once, our world of origin. We lost it in the way that you are losing yours. We concluded. We left. We did not. The amber structures were very still. We did not make each other tea afterward. Nobody said anything. The wind moved. The sea moved. The fleet above them, the 1200 ships in the sky that had come to execute a sentence, made no sound and no movement. We lost it," Sev said very quietly, "and we did not stop either. We kept going. But we kept going alone. We did not know how to do what you just did. Put a warm thing next to an unknown creature in the hope that warmth would cross the distance." Tomas said, to nobody in particular. "I didn't really think about it that much." "That," Sev said, "is precisely the point." By noon, the crew of Rig Halcyon had set up a rough table on the deck using 2 crates and a piece of plywood, and 12 humans and 1 alien were sitting around it, eating whatever was available from the galley, which turned out to be canned soup and bread, and the remains of a birthday cake that had been made for the junior engineer's 26th birthday. 2 days prior, Sev did not eat. It did not have the apparatus for eating in the human sense, but it sat at the table, and it held a second mug of tea, and it watched them eat with the amber eyes, and it asked questions, and they answered, and the quality of the questions changed gradually over the course of those hours in a way that Bernard was documenting with increasing urgency and increasing excitement, because the questions shifted from assessment questions, questions designed to gather data, to measure, to evaluate, to something else, something that he identified after some consideration as curiosity, not tactical curiosity, not the curiosity of a researcher building a case. The curiosity of something that has encountered a thing it did not know existed and wants to know more about it because it wants to know more about it, for no operational reason, simply because. Yuki, the navigation engineer, was talking about her daughter. Her daughter was 9 and had recently become obsessed with ants. Not as a scientific interest, as a genuine, passionate, slightly inexplicable love. She talked about ants to everyone. She had drawn pictures of ants. She had named particular ants in the garden and was tracking their behavior in a small notebook she kept under her pillow. Why? Sev said. Because she found them interesting, Yuki said. They are not useful to her, no. They do not benefit her in any measurable way, not directly. But she names them. She names them, Yuki confirmed. The amber structures were very still. We have a name for this phenomenon, Sev said. In our language. A name for the practice of extending personhood to things that do not need personhood extended to them. We have a word for it. A pause. In our language, the word has a negative connotation. It is considered an error of reasoning. What's the word? Bernard asked. It does not translate exactly. The closest you have? Sev paused for a long moment, clearly not consulting a database but genuinely searching. Is something like affection misapplied? We call it love, Marin said, when we do it to each other. We call it different things when we do it to ants. You do it to ants, and to rocks, and to places, and to things that are gone. We extend. She tried to find the right shape for it. We extend ourselves toward things. It's what we do. It's how we take up space in the universe. Not by owning things, not by cataloging them, by caring about them. Even when caring about them doesn't help us. Even when it costs us something. She looked at the birthday cake on the table, half-eaten, a little lopsided because Tomas had made it and baking was not his strength. Someone had drawn a small rocket ship in the icing. That cake is a perfect example. Someone made it badly. Someone drew a terrible rocket on it. Everyone ate it and said it was delicious, even though it wasn't, particularly. And now every time any of us looks at it, we feel something about the person who made it, and the person it was made for, and we'll probably remember this birthday for the rest of our lives, whichever form that takes. She looked at Sev. Why do we do that? I genuinely don't know, but I know we can't stop. Sev was very quiet for a long time. Then it said, show me the rocket. The birthday rocket became something of a symbol in the months that followed, though Marin resisted that framing when journalists later asked about it. Symbols were assigned after the fact by people who hadn't been there. What it had been in the moment was just Sev looking at a badly drawn icing rocket on a lopsided cake on a folding table in the North Sea while 12 cold people ate soup and the end of the world hung, patient and immovable, above them. What it had been was a pause. The pause was the thing. Not a decision, not a reversal, just a pause in the mechanism of something that had been in motion for a long time, a single hesitation in a gear that had never hesitated before. Sev transmitted something to the fleet at 14:23 that afternoon. The fleet responded. Another transmission, a long one by the metrics they were able to measure, a full 11 minutes of that subaudible vibration that their instruments caught as structured signal. Sev's fur moved throughout in a way that Bernard described as distress, but that Marin thought was more like negotiation, the physical expression of an argument being conducted with oneself or with others, through means they couldn't fully observe. When it was done, Sev sat still for a moment. Then it said, there are others of us, on the surface, conducting similar assessments at other points. We are designed to proceed independently and collectively, which means, you each have a vote, Bernard said. The amber structure settled on him. An approximation, and you're calling a meeting another approximation, but not a bad one. Sev's fur moved slightly. It had been doing that more over the course of the day, small movements that were beginning to take on a legibility, a grammar. Bernard had pages of observations about it. Marin had, more simply, begun to read them the way you read the face of someone you've been in a small space with for a long time. This one she was reading as something close to reluctant humor. Your species, Sev said, is going to be extremely difficult to be correct about. We get that a lot, Tomas said. The secondary contact happened in 37 locations simultaneously. They had been everywhere already, on rooftops, in fields at sea, in city centers and wilderness stations and weather observation posts, anywhere humans had positioned themselves at the edges of things, in the places where the crowd thinned and the sky came closer. They had been observing. They had been, in several cases, already in conversation, in that same barely audible register, with the humans who happened to be there. The reports came in as connectivity restored, fragmentary at first, Then in flood, carried on satellite uplinks and radio relays and the emergency infrastructure that had, remarkably, survived the arrival largely intact. The fleet had not disabled communication. It had not, Marin realized, disabled anything. The shutdown of normal channels had been, in several cases, a side effect of human infrastructure overwhelmed by human panic rather than any deliberate action on the fleet's part. They hadn't come in attacking. They'd come in the way you come somewhere when you've already decided the outcome and need only to confirm it. The execution of a decision already made, a sentence already passed, a verdict that required only its own enactment to be complete. What they hadn't come prepared for was the part where humans kept talking to them. The reports described it differently everywhere they happened, but the shape was the same. A human alone or in a small group, in a place that was neither fortress nor capital but just a place, a mundane human place, who encountered one of the Moja scouts and did not run and did not attack but simply stayed, talked, asked questions, offered something, food they couldn't eat, or warmth they might not need, or the specific human act of showing an alien a photograph, a letter, a terrible drawing made by a child. In a lighthouse on the Norwegian coast, the keeper showed her scout a box of sea glass she'd collected over 40 years, one piece at a time, each one labeled with the date and location of its finding. The scout spent 2 hours examining each piece, running its limb structure over the surfaces, the smooth ones, the frosted ones, the ones worn by decades of tide into shapes that suggested nothing and everything. The keeper explained each one without being asked, where she'd found it, what the weather had been, whether someone had been with her. The scout did not interrupt. When the keeper reached the oldest piece, labeled September 14, 1983, and said simply, "That was the day my son was born," the scout held it for 40 minutes and said nothing, and then said very carefully, "We do not have this." And the keeper had said, "I know, I'm sorry." And the scout had said, "Do not be sorry, we are reconsidering." At a research station in Iceland, 4 volcanologists explained the eruption patterns of the Katla system to a Moja who had asked, apparently, what humans did with knowledge they had gathered about things they couldn't change. They explained that they studied it anyway. They had been studying Katla for 100 years. It was still going to erupt. They were still going to study it. One of them produced a notebook full of measurements going back 40 years, handwritten in margins, crowded with corrections and cross-references and the occasional drawing of the mountain from memory. The scout looked at the drawings for a long time. "You draw it," it said, "when you already have instruments." "Yes," the volcanologist said. "The instruments are more accurate. But the drawing is different. What is it?" the scout asked. The scout was not asking what a drawing was. It was asking what it was in addition to a drawing. "It's ours," the volcanologist said. "That's what it is. It's how something becomes ours." In a fishing village on the Faroe Islands, an 83-year-old woman made a Moja scout sit with her on her porch for 3 hours while she told it the names of everyone she had ever loved, in order, beginning with her mother. She had a very good memory. The list was long. She did not explain the significance of each name. She simply said the names, one after another, in a voice that had carried these names for decades and would carry them until she couldn't. And then they would go somewhere else, into the air, into the memory of anyone who had heard them. The scout did not move until she was finished. When she finished, it said, "How many?" She counted. She told it. It said, "You have kept all of them." She said, "Yes." It said, "Why?" She thought about it for a moment and said, "Because they happened. Because they were real. Because forgetting a person is a kind of killing them twice. And I'm not willing to do that." The scout held its stillness for a long time. Then it said, "We have a word for that." She asked what the word was. In our language, it said, "The word means the refusal to let the record close." The patterns emerged from the noise the way the structure of the original transmission had, emerged from the static, not immediately, not without effort, but successively, once you were looking for them. And what the patterns showed was this. Everywhere the Moja encountered humans who had stayed, humans who had not fled or armed themselves or tried to bargain with threat, but simply stayed and offered the specific texture of their humanity. The small things, the private things, the particular and irreducible things. The Moja paused. They all paused, not all of them indefinitely. Some re-engaged with the mission. Some transmitted back to the fleet and received confirmation and moved on toward the business of ending things. In 7 locations, what followed was not conversation. Marin knew this and held it alongside everything else. The way you hold the weight of what's been lost alongside the weight of what's still standing. It wasn't clean. It was never going to be clean. But in 30 of the 37 locations, the pause extended, and in 23 of those 30, the Moja representative asked to continue talking. Bernard had not slept in 31 hours when he wrote the note that would later become the foundation of what some people called the Halcyon Protocols and others called, with varying degrees of irony, the Humanity Defense Document, though that name ignored the fact that it wasn't a defense at all. Defense implies an adversary. What Bernard wrote, hunched over his notebook in the radio shack with the North Sea outside and the fleet still visible on the horizon, was something more like a translation guide. The specific conditions under which the Moja paused, he wrote, all had a common structure. They were not paused by demonstrations of power, or intelligence, or technological sophistication. They were not paused by arguments, logical or emotional. They were not paused by information, since the information was what they had already assessed and found wanting. They were paused by specificity, by the irreducible particularity of a human moment that could not be generalized into data, the sea glass labeled by date and location, the names of everyone ever loved in order, beginning with the mother, the terrible rocket on the birthday cake, the mug of tea set down without calculation next to something that had come to destroy the world, the volcanologist's drawing of the mountain, less accurate than instruments but more true than data because it was ours. Not humanity as a species, as a concept, as a case study in civilizational collapse. Humans as specific people in specific moments doing specific small things that had no justification except that this is what humans do when they are most fully themselves, when they are not defending or performing or demonstrating, when they are just there in the cold morning with a cup of tea watching the sky. The Moja, he wrote, came from a culture of correct conclusions. They had assessed and judged with rigor and consistency, and the result had been, invariably, the same result. A species determined to be harmful was determined to be harmful. Full stop. Sentence passed. Action taken. They had done this before. It had always worked before. There had never been, in the documented history of their assessments, a case where the moment of enactment produced this specific complication. The complication was that humans in their particularity were not the same thing as humans in the data. Not because the data was wrong. The data was correct, the harm was real, the trajectory was what it had been assessed to be, but because the specific person holding the sea glass was not the trajectory, was not the data, was not the aggregate, was Ingrid, 63 years old, who had spent 40 years of mornings picking glass out of the surf because she found it beautiful and it cost nothing and it gave her something she didn't have a name for. Who had told the Moja this because it asked? Who had handed it the oldest piece? The one labeled September 14, 1983, which was the day her son was born. The Moja had held that piece for 40 minutes. Then it had said, "We do not have this." And Ingrid had said, "I know, I'm sorry." And the Moja had said, "Do not be sorry. We are reconsidering." The fleet withdrew on the 9th day. Not completely, not permanently. They moved from immediate orbit to a position further out, beyond the moon, which the Moja representatives explained. Through Bernard and through the network of improvised translators that had assembled across every contact point as a gesture equivalent to, "We are not leaving, but we are waiting. The sentence is suspended. The suspension is contingent. We will be here." The conditions for suspension were not a guarantee. The Moja were not promising anything. They were not charmed or converted or overcome. The harm they had assessed was real, and they knew it was real, and they said so plainly every time the subject arose. And Marin respected them for it. They did not pretend the evidence away. They held it and continued to hold it and said, "This is still what the data says. We are not ignoring the data." What they were doing, what Sev explained, sitting on the deck of Rig Halcyon on the 8th evening as the northern lights moved above them in their cold green and violet sheets, colors that Sev's fur mimicked unconsciously, the way a mood passes from one person to another across a shared space, was introducing a new variable. In our system, Sev said, assessment is terminal. A thing is determined and the determination stands. There is no mechanism for the possibility that the thing assessed might contain something the assessment missed. Pride, Bernard said. An approximation, but not a bad one. The reluctant humor ripple. Less reluctant now. More frequent over these days, as though the grammar of it was loosening with use. Your species, Sev said, has shown us a structural flaw in our methodology. You were assessed without being witnessed. The data was not inaccurate. The data was not inaccurate, but the data was not complete. There is a layer of you that does not appear in aggregate measurements. That requires a long pause. The fur went the color of the northern lights for a moment. That requires sitting on a deck in the cold and being offered a cup of tea. Most good things do, Marin said. Sev's fur moved through several colors she hadn't seen before. She didn't have words for what they meant yet. She was going to spend a long time learning. We are not forgiving you, Sev said. I want to be precise about this. The harm is real. The trajectory is real. We are not setting it aside, I know. We are staying near it. We are. The amber eyes were very steady in the northern light. We are choosing to keep looking, to see if the thing we saw in you, if it is what it appeared to be, if it grows, if it holds against the weight of what you know about yourselves. And if it doesn't, a pause. The fleet invisible beyond the moon hummed in her awareness like a distant note. Then we will have watched something honest, Sev said. We have not done that before. There is a word for it, in our language, for the witnessing of something that may fail but is trying in a way that has not been modeled. In our language, the connotation is also negative. What does it mean? Something like hope that cannot be justified. The northern lights moved. Marin thought about 0347 in the morning, about the frequency nobody monitored, about the list of things she'd been grateful for read out into the empty dark. A meal, a quality of light, a joke that made her laugh until she sat down. Thank you, to no one, to the open air. We have a word for that too, she said. Yes, Sev said. We know. We intercepted quite a lot of it before we arrived. The fur moved slowly, a long ripple from front to back and front again. It was, in the end, part of why we hesitated. The transmissions into the void. We could not determine what they were for. We still cannot determine exactly what they are for. The amber structures settled on her face, entirely steady. But we have determined that they are not nothing. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing that followed was simple. The Moja had come to end things and had paused instead, and the world had to figure out what to do with a pause, what it meant, how long it lasted, what it required. The representatives, Sev and 11 others who had been involved in the initial contacts, who had sat with sea glass and heard names and been handed birthday cake, became something that had no name yet in any human language, something between envoys and witnesses and the representatives of a judgment still in effect. They were not tourists. They were not guests. They were not the friendly aliens of 100 films who had come to share technology and heal old wounds. They were the assessment still ongoing, the sentence still suspended, the eyes still watching. Marin found she was glad for that, glad that nobody had rounded the edges of what they were, glad that it was honest. There were people who wanted to round the edges. There were people who wanted to declare victory, to call it humanity's finest hour, to build monuments to the 14 contacts and the 30 pauses and the 23 who kept talking. Marin understood the impulse and refused it. Victory was not the right word for a suspended sentence. Finest hour was not the right phrase for the moment when a species was told, by something older and further traveled than itself, that the evidence of its harm was real and unarguable, and that the only reason the evidence had not yet been enacted into an ending was a cup of tea and a terrible rocket on a birthday cake. What it was, she thought, was a chance, the cleanest possible word for it. Not earned, not won, not deserved. A chance extended by something that had no obligation to extend it, on the basis of something it had seen that it hadn't known was there. She and Sev developed something that she also declined to name. Not because she couldn't find a word for it, but because naming it felt like a form of pinning it down, and she wanted it to remain able to move. They talked in the radio shack, often, in the early mornings. Sev had found that it preferred the radio shack to the deck, preferring enclosed spaces after the long crossing between stars, the preference for walls, the way a sailor develops a preference for walls after too long at sea. It sat on the equipment shelf. Marin made tea. They talked about things that were not the assessment, or they talked about things that were only obliquely the assessment, or they talked about the assessment directly and without softening, because Sev was not the kind of creature to allow softening, and Marin had been alone in the North Sea long enough to lose the appetite for it herself. Sev told her about the world they'd come from. Not with nostalgia. The Moja, it explained, did not experience nostalgia in the way her people did, the backward pull toward a specific time and place that had become irretrievable. What they had instead was something like a permanent internal record, a complete and unremoved archive of everything that had been, carried in every cell of the body like a weight that did not increase or decrease but was always exactly its own size. They carried their lost world with them at all weight, all the time. They had been carrying it for a long time. Does it hurt? Marin asked. A long pause. The fur moved. That is a translation that does not simplify cleanly, does it? She tried a different approach. Is it a thing you would want to put down if you could? The amber structures were very still. No, Sev said, no, we would not. Then maybe it's not so different. The fur rippled in colors she'd begun to learn. The one that meant something close to. You have said a thing I was not ready for. She handed it the tea. It held the mug. Outside, the North Sea was doing what it always did, building itself into something gray and slow and patient and permanent. The thing you do, Sev said. The transmissions into the void. When you are alone. Yes. What did it feel like, to know that someone received it? She thought about it carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. It felt like it had always been heard, she said finally, not just on the day you received it. Like the act of sending it had already been a kind of receiving. Like putting it into the world had already been enough, even without knowing that it had arrived. She looked at the equipment, at the dials and the frequencies. At the console she'd been sitting at alone at 03:47 in the morning, reading a letter to her dead father into the empty dark. And then knowing that it had arrived, she stopped. It felt like something I didn't know I needed. The fur held its color for a moment, stable. The color she'd learned meant something close to, sitting with a thing before deciding what it means. We are a very old species, Sev said, after a while. We have made many assessments, we have never. It paused. We have never been received. We have transmitted. We have assessed. We have concluded and acted and moved on. We have never had something we transmitted arrive somewhere and be held. Marin said nothing. The moment had a shape to it that words would have damaged. Your letter, Sev said. The one you read into the frequency. She waited. To your father, yes. He could not hear it. No, and yet you sent it. Yes, why? She looked at the console, at the dials. At the readout that still, even now, sometimes caught fragments of the Moja fleet's transmissions and displayed them as patterns she was slowly learning to read. Because, she said carefully, he would have wanted to know, even though he couldn't know. The wanting of it felt like. She stopped. It felt like a form of respect for what he was, for the fact that he had been real and had mattered, and that mattering doesn't stop when the person stops. She looked at Sev. We don't have a very good relationship with endings. We know they're real. We accept them, eventually. But we don't stop caring about the things that ended. We keep talking to them. We keep sending letters to frequencies they can't receive. She paused. Maybe that's a flaw. Or maybe it is the thing that distinguishes a species that is worth the trouble of witnessing, Sev said. She looked at it. The fur was the color she didn't have a word for yet. The birthday cake became a second symbol, in the way that things become symbols when they are specific enough. Not because it was the first thing or the most important thing. Not because a cake was, in any rational accounting, a weapon against an extinction-level judgment delivered by a species capable of crossing the distance between stars. But because it was the most human thing, in the specific sense that mattered, thoughtless, warm, badly executed, and offered without calculation to whatever was nearest. Tomas, who had made both cakes and would make more, became briefly famous in a way that he found confusing and a little embarrassing. He gave one interview to a journalist who'd flown out to Halcyon in the first month after the withdrawal, and what he said was, I just made a cake. I make cakes for birthdays. That's what I do. The journalist tried to make this into something larger, and Tomas kept returning to the fact of the cake with the dogged practicality of a man who had fixed drilling equipment for 20 years and understood that most things were more useful than they were meaningful, and that this was fine. I made a cake, he said. The alien looked at the rocket on it. That's what happened. What happened, Marin would have added, was that the alien looked at the rocket on it and saw a human being trying to do something nice for another human being with the tools available, which were inadequate, and the result was imperfect, and nobody pretended otherwise, and it was offered anyway, and received anyway, and valued anyway. Not despite its imperfection, but in some way that was inseparable from it. The Moja had seen a lot of imperfect things. Their assessment had cataloged them in considerable detail. The imperfect things were, in large part, the basis of the sentence. What they had not cataloged was the cake. The specific human practice of making something imperfect and naming it as an offering and giving it to someone and watching them receive it. The loop of it. The completion it made that had nothing to do with quality and everything to do with the fact of the attempt. They have a word for it now, Bernard noted in the formal record 2 years later. In the Moja language, the word previously translated as affection misapplied has been revised by their own scholars. in their first internal linguistic revision in 1100 years. The new translation is, the practice of completing the loop. On the 1-year anniversary of the arrival, by human reckoning, Rig Halcyon held a birthday party. It was Thomas's birthday. He was 47. He'd been 47 for a week already because Marin had miscounted the days. They'd had a busy week. And when she realized she'd made an emergency call to the mainland to get the ingredients flown out on the supply run, and they'd arrived 2 days late, and the party was therefore 2 days late. But nobody cared because the party had been planned, and that was the point. Sev sat on the deck railing. The secondary representative, the one Marin had started calling Six in her head because she had not been able to render its name in any human phoneme, and it had, after some consideration, accepted this with what she had learned to read as gracious resignation. Six sat on the opposite railing. The northern lights were not visible. It was November again, and the sky was overcast. The same low gray ceiling it had been when all of this began. But the lights were up there somewhere. They always were. Tomas cut the cake. This year's cake was also badly made. He had, with some confidence, drawn another rocket in the icing, and this rocket was worse than the first one, which the crew treated as an achievement. There had been a small, serious argument about how bad a rocket could legitimately be while still being a rocket, and the consensus was that Tomas had found the absolute outer limit. Sev had been watching the argument with an expression, and Marin had learned to read expressions in Sev's fur the way you learn to read expressions in a face, through accumulation and attention, that she identified as the specific state it entered when it encountered something that its models had not included and was not yet sure whether to class as irrational or as a different kind of logic entirely. The rocket, Sev said, is worse. Much worse, Tomas agreed, but it is still a rocket. I think so, you put it there anyway. Tomas looked at the cake, at the terrible rocket in its terrible icing, at the 47 candles that had been a challenge to fit. He picked up the knife. Yeah, he said, I put it there anyway. Sev's fur moved through the new colors, the ones she hadn't been able to name for a long time and had finally, 2 months ago, found words for imperfect words, approximate words, the best words she had. Sev's fur moved through the color that meant a thing that should not work by any reasonable accounting and yet does, and the color beside it, adjacent, which meant, witnessing this for the first time, both colors together. Marin, without entirely deciding to, began to hum. Something her mother had sung once when she was small and the nights were long. It meant nothing to the Moja. It had no operational function in the behavioral economy of either species. But Yuki, who had heard it somewhere before, picked it up, and then Rafal, who hadn't but who caught the shape of it the way you catch the shape of a tune across a crowded room. Just the outline of it, just enough, and they were all humming it by the time the candles were all lit. 12 people and 2 alien representatives on a rig in the North Sea in November, under an overcast sky. Tomas laughed. I don't know this one. You don't have to know it, Marin said. Just listen. Sev's fur moved in waves, slow and steady, cycling through colors she could name and colors she couldn't. The seen world and the not yet seen world, carrying the light and the dark of what had come before and what was still open. The fleet was beyond the moon. It was watching. The sentence was suspended and the weight of it was real, and the trajectory of the harm was real, and none of that had been set aside, and she did not want it set aside. But the candles were burning, and outside the North Sea was doing what it always did. Tomas blew out the candles. The smoke moved into the cold air and became the cold air and was gone. Happy birthday, she said. Happy birthday, said 12 voices. And then, in a register she felt in her teeth and her chest, in the lower frequencies of a voice that had come from somewhere else in the universe and had, 9 days in, decided to stay. Happy birthday. The lights were coming back up overhead. She could see them now, bleeding through the cloud cover in thin sheets of green and violet. The sky was opening, the way it sometimes did out here, when the pressure systems shifted and the overcast broke, and the world above the world became briefly visible. Sev's fur held the colors of the lights. 6 on the opposite railing did the same. Marin looked at them, and then at the cake, and then at the terrible rocket, and then at the sky. Thank you, she thought, to no one. To the empty air, to the part of the void that had been listening. She had known, for a year now, that the void listened back. It didn't change anything. The harm was real. The work was real. The weight of what they'd have to become to be worth the pause was real, and the probability of becoming it in the time available was not a comfortable thing to hold in the mind. Some nights she lay in her bunk on Rig Halcyon and held it, the full weight of it, the conditional nature of the reprieve, the specific precariousness of being a species on probation with the universe, watched by something old enough to have seen species end before and patient enough to wait out the result. She held it and didn't look away from it, because that was what you did with real things. You looked at them. You didn't dress them in comfort they hadn't earned or shelter them behind optimism that wasn't warranted. You looked at them directly, in the cold, with whatever you had, and you stayed. Staying was the thing. It had always been the thing. Not winning, not being clever or powerful or right. Staying in the cold with whatever you had, with the mug of tea and the terrible rocket and the names of everyone you'd loved in order from the beginning, and the letter broadcast into the void on a frequency nobody monitored, and the 40 years of sea glass labeled by date, and the drawing of the mountain that was less accurate than instruments, and the question asked and asked again into the empty dark. Thank you. For what? For nothing you can point to. For everything. For the specific fact of being here and cold and imperfect and not stopped yet. She held it, the real weight of the conditional, and she also held the tea. And both hands were full, and that was fine. That was exactly fine. Because the alternative was to stop, and she was not built to stop. None of them were. That was the thing about them. The thing the data had missed, the variable the models had not included. The thing you could not learn from aggregate measurements or broadcast records, or the long careful record of a species in the process of its own diminishment. You had to sit with them. You had to let them give you tea. You had to watch them make a worse cake every year on purpose, and put a rocket on it that was barely recognizable as a rocket, and light the candles, and hum something into the cold air that the other person didn't know, and wait. You had to wait, in the specific cold morning of their specific existence, for the thing they did that the data had missed. The thing they did. The thing they did. They stayed. 3 years after the arrival, Marin left the rig. Not permanently, she came back, would always come back, had by that point stopped being able to imagine a version of herself that didn't have the North Sea as its fixed point. But she left for 6 months, because Bernard had asked her to join him at the Halcyon Institute, which had set up in a converted facility outside Stavanger and which was, depending on who you asked, either a translation center or a diplomatic mission or a research program or the most important institution in the history of human civilization, and which Bernard called simply the work, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent his career arguing that this work should exist and now found it did. The institute housed 4 human translators and 3 Moja representatives, including Sev. It was not a comfortable arrangement. Moja preferred lower temperatures than humans found comfortable. Humans preferred a level of ambient noise that Moja found intrusive. The building had been divided into zones with different climate control settings, and the transition corridors were a no-man's land of tepid air and diplomatic footwear, where everyone walked faster than they normally would. Marin's role was something the Institute called a direct contact anchor. Someone who had established a working relationship with a specific Moja representative and could serve as a context holder for the harder conversations, the ones where language failed and what filled the gap needed to be trust. In practice, this meant sitting in small rooms with Sev for several hours a day, while Bernard and the Moja scholars worked through the formal vocabulary exchange and catching the things that didn't survive formal vocabulary, the inflections, the fur color shifts, the pauses that had their own grammar, and feeding them back into the translation record. It also meant walking on the shore with Sev at night, which was a practice they'd arrived at without discussing it. The way practices arrive that are more honest than decisions. The shore near Stavanger in winter was not warm. It was, in fact, the kind of cold that requires commitment. Sev's fur handled it without difficulty. Marin wore everything she owned in layers and accepted the cold the way you accept the conditions of something that matters more than the conditions. Sev had been learning to ask better questions. Not better in the sense of more sophisticated. The sophistication had always been there, the precision of a species that thought very carefully before speaking. Better in the sense of less complete, more genuinely open-ended. Questions that had been constructed with a gap in them where the answer could go, rather than questions that had the answer pre-installed and were seeking confirmation. "What is this one?" Sev said one night, meaning the lights on the water, the reflection of the town visible on the surface of the fjord, broken by the low chop into something that moved and flickered. "Light on water," Marin said. "Yes. But you looked at it differently when you said that." "I like it," she said. "I've always liked it." Something about the way the reflection moves when it shouldn't. You know the light is static, the source isn't moving, but the water makes it move anyway. It makes something stable look alive. Sev was quiet for a moment. The fur shifted through a color she now knew well. The one that meant it was storing something, archiving not just the content of what had been said, but the shape of the saying, the particular way the human in front of it had held the thing they were describing. We have observed that humans ascribe significance to these small consistencies, Sev said. Recurring patterns in sensory experience. Light on water. The way certain sounds occur repeatedly. Water moving or wind in specific vegetation or particular silences. Its fur moved. In our assessment, we categorize these as low-level habituation responses. Learned comfort through repetition, maybe, Marin said. But you are not describing comfort, Sev said. You described something you find. It paused, searching for the word they'd agreed on during a session 3 weeks ago. Beautiful. Yes. And the difference between comfort and beautiful is, comfort is about you, Marin said. Beautiful is about the thing. She looked at the light on the water. Comfort means, this is good for me. Beautiful means, this is good, just in itself, regardless of me. She paused. When I'm gone, the light will still be beautiful. I won't be here to call it that, but it'll be it, whatever it is. The fur held a color for a long time, a color she'd only recently learned the word for. It translated, roughly, as the feeling of having understood something that changes the shape of everything understood before it. We do not have that, Sev said. In our framework, a thing is valuable when it is valued. Value is not inherent. It is relational. It exists between the assessor and the assessed. We mostly believe that too, Marin said, but we can't fully commit to it. We keep having the suspicion that the thing is more than the valuing. That the light on the water is something specific, whether or not there's an eye to catch it. She shrugged, the movement slightly uncomfortable under all the layers. Maybe that's a philosophical error. But it's one we've been making for a very long time, and I don't think we're going to stop. It is, Sev said. Perhaps the error that makes the rest of you legible. She looked at it. The fur was the color of understanding that changes the shape of things. She'd thought that color was about the Moja's understanding of humans. But looking at it now, in the reflection light, she thought maybe it was more mutual than that. Maybe both of them were standing on a shore in the dark, catching a new shape of something. And the event was this, exactly this. Two entirely different kinds of being, in the cold, looking at the light on the water, arriving at the same question from completely different directions, and finding, in the arriving, that they were closer than either had expected. Sev, she said, yes, what did your world look like, the one you lost? A long pause. The fur was very still. I have told you about it, Sev said. In the record. You told me the facts of it, Marin said. I'm asking what it looked like. Another long pause. The cold moved between them. The light moved on the water. Then Sev said, there was a place near the northern edge of our third continent where the thermal vents met the ice sheets, and the steam that rose from that meeting was a color that has no name in your language. It was not any color in your spectrum. When our young were first brought to see it, we had no word for it in our language either. The word we eventually made for it is the oldest word in our naming tradition. The color of the first thing we called beautiful. Marin didn't say anything. It is still there, Sev said. Technically, the world still exists as matter. But the vents are cold now, and the ice is gone, and the thing that made the color no longer occurs. It paused. We have the word. We have no referent for it. It names something that cannot be seen anymore. That's not nothing, Marin said carefully. Having the word. We have debated this for a very long time, Sev said. Some of us think it is only loss in a second form. Some of us think. The fur rippled through the archiving color. Some of us think it is the refusal to let the record close. The light moved on the water. I think, Marin said, that both are true. Sev's fur held a color she'd never seen before. It was not in the archive. She watched it carefully and filed it. And later that night, back at the Institute, she described it to Bernard, and he asked what she thought it meant, and she said she wasn't sure, but her best translation was something like, you are not who we assessed you to be, in the best sense. And Bernard wrote it down, because he was that kind of man. The formal revision of the assessment took 4 years. It was not a forgiveness. The Moja did not have forgiveness in their framework, and were precise about not borrowing the concept from a framework they didn't share. What it was, in their language, was a reclassification. Humanity was moved from the category that translated as harm, without recovery, to the category that translated, awkwardly but sincerely, as harm with a specific variable. The specific variable had a formal definition in the revised assessment. Bernard translated it into English, and the translation was, as he admitted in the introduction, not fully adequate. It ran to 3 paragraphs. The core of it was this: a species that maintains the practice of transmitting gratitude into the void with no expectation of reception, that names things it cannot own and loves things it cannot hold, and persists in the making of offerings inadequate to the weight of what it intends, that carries its dead in its vocabulary and its lost world in its muscle memory, that stands in the cold with a cup of tea and sets a second cup down for whatever comes next. Such a species represents a variable not previously encountered in any prior assessment, and for which the existing categorical framework is insufficient. The assessment remains open. Marin read it standing in the radio shack on Rig Halcyon on a Tuesday morning in November, 4 years to the week from the night she'd first heard the signal. The drill was quiet. They'd finished a maintenance cycle, and the rig was in a rested period, which meant the only sounds were the sea and the wind and the distant creak of the platform and the current, all of which were old friends by now, all of which she had names for. She read the document twice, then she set it down. She looked at the console, at the frequency dials, at the readout where, 4 years ago, she'd first seen the pattern of a voice that had come from somewhere else. She sat down. She put on the headset. She turned to the personal frequency, the one nobody monitored, the one she'd broadcast on alone at 03:47 in the morning before any of this had happened. She sat there for a while. Then she said, to no one, to the empty air, to the part of the void that had been listening, "Thank you." She listed things, small things. The quality of the light that morning, coming in off the water at an angle she'd seen 1,000 times and still didn't have words for. A conversation she'd had with Sev 2 weeks ago that she'd been turning over in her mind like a piece of sea glass, feeling the worn edges of it. The fact that Tamaz had brought her coffee without being asked, the right amount of sugar, which she hadn't told him but which he'd learned over 4 years of proximity, which was its own kind of language, which was what people were made of when you stripped away the abstract. The northern lights, which she hadn't seen this week but which she'd seen enough times to carry in her body. Her father, his particular laugh, the letter. She ended where she always ended. Thank you. To no one, to the open air, to whatever was listening. She knew now that something was. She took the headset off. She set it on the console. Outside, the North Sea was doing what it always did. She made herself a cup of tea. She thought about whether to make a second cup and leave it somewhere, for whatever came next. She decided yes. She always decided yes. That was the thing about her, the specific thing, the irreducible thing, the thing that didn't appear in aggregate data or civilizational trajectory assessments. But that was as real as the cold and as constant as the light on the water. The assessment was still open. The sentence was still suspended. The work was real, and the harm was real, and the probability of getting it right in the time available was not a comfortable thing to carry. She carried it. She made the tea. She put the second cup down on the edge of the console next to the headset, steaming in the cold air of the radio shack on a November morning on a drilling platform in the North Sea, offered to whatever needed it, which might be nothing, which might be everything, which was not the point. The point was the offering. The point was always the offering. She had never needed anyone to teach her that. She had just always known. There was a girl in Reykjavik who had been 9 years old when they came. Her name was Astrid. Her mother was one of the volcanologists who had explained Katla to the Moja Scout in those first frantic days, and Astrid had been at school when it happened, which meant she had experienced the arrival the way most children experienced it. Not through the first contact or the radio frequencies or the rooftop conversations, but through the sudden silence of every adult in the building. The teachers who stopped mid-lesson and stood very still for a moment, listening to something on their phones, wearing expressions she had never seen before and would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. She was 13 now, and she had been corresponding with Sev for 8 months. This had happened by accident, in the way that the most important things happen. Astrid's mother had brought her to the institute during a school holiday when childcare arrangements had fallen through, and Astrid had ended up sitting in a corner of the translation archive room while Bernard and her mother worked, and Sev had come in to review a vocabulary entry, and Astrid had looked up from the book she was reading and said, without apparent anxiety, "You're the one who sat on the rig." Sev had looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," it said. "I know about the cake," Astrid said. Sev's fur had moved in a way that everyone in the room recognized as the reluctant humor ripple, which had become considerably less reluctant over 4 years and was now simply humor unqualified. Everyone knows about the cake, Sev said. They had been corresponding since then, which in practice meant that Astrid wrote long, detailed letters about things she was thinking about, and Sev responded with questions, not assessment questions. The other kind, the kind with the gap in them. Astrid wrote about the ants. Her interest in ants had not diminished with age. It had, if anything, intensified and formalized. She was now keeping a structured observation log, tracking the activity of 3 separate colonies in the garden, and she had been reading academic papers on ant cognition and collective behavior with the focus of someone who had found the thing they were going to dedicate their life to and was simply impatient to begin. Sev asked, "What is it about them specifically?" Astrid wrote back, "The way they know things without any single ant knowing them. The way the colony has information that no individual ant possesses. The queen doesn't know the whole colony. The workers don't know the whole colony. But the colony knows the colony." Sev wrote back, through Bernard, who served as their intermediary, which Astrid found slightly irritating, but accepted with the pragmatism of someone who has learned that getting the important things sometimes means accepting the inconvenient packaging. Sev wrote back, "We have a concept like this. In our language, it has a name that translates approximately as the knowledge that lives between the knowing." Astrid wrote back immediately, "That's the best thing I've ever heard." Sev, in its response, used the color description notation that Bernard had developed for the formal record, a system of 3-part codes that indicated fur color, pattern, and duration. The code in Sev's response translated to the color that meant witnessing this for the first time. Bernard noted this in the archive with a small mark in the margin that meant significant, underdetermined, return to later. He returned to it 6 months later, when Astrid came back to the Institute during another school holiday and spent 3 hours in the translation archive room talking to Sev directly without Bernard's mediation, in a conversation that neither of them reported in full detail to anyone. What Marin knew of it, she knew from Sev, who told her that evening on their shore walk. She asked about the assessment. Sev said, "What did you tell her?" "The truth of it." The fur moved in the archiving color. She said, "So you're still deciding?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Good. I'd be worried if you'd already decided." Marin looked at the water. "And then," Sev said, she said, "I'd be worried if you'd already decided, because the whole point of paying attention is that you might see something you didn't expect. And if you'd already decided, you couldn't pay attention properly. You'd just be watching for confirmation." Marin said nothing. "She is," Sev said, 13 years old. "Yes. And she has already understood something that our assessment methodology had not accounted for in 1100 years of operation." The light moved on the water. "Did you tell her that?" Marin asked. "I told her that her observation had been entered in the formal revision record as a primary source." Marin laughed. "It was the real kind, the kind that required sitting down." And she sat down on the cold rocks of the Stavanger shore and laughed until she had to put her hands on her knees and breathe, and Sev sat beside her, and its fur moved through something she'd never seen before. Something that she would describe later, in the archive, as the witnessing of joy as a complete event requiring no addition. "She said something else," Sev said when Marin had finished. "At the end." "What?" She said, "When you go back to your people, tell them about the ants, not about us. Tell them about the ants. Tell them about the thing that knows things without any single part of it knowing them. Tell them that's what we are, not what we're afraid of, not what we're capable of destroying, what we're capable of being." The fur was the new color, the witnessing joy color, she said. "That's the argument. That's the one that might work. Not our greatness, our strangeness, the specific, irreducible strangeness of us." The light moved on the water. Marin sat on the rocks in the cold and thought about a 9-year-old girl naming ants in a garden, and a 13-year-old girl explaining collective intelligence to an alien that had come from the other side of the sky with a verdict already prepared, and the verdict still suspended, and the assessment still open, and whatever came next not decided yet, not at all, not even close. She thought about what it meant to be a species whose children, upon meeting the thing that had come to end them, immediately started thinking about how to make the argument better. Not because they were required to. Not because someone had told them to, because they couldn't help it. Because they were built the way they were built, imperfect and persistent, transmitting into the void on frequencies nobody monitored, making offerings to whatever came next, naming the things they couldn't own, loving the things they couldn't hold, carrying the dead in their vocabulary and the lost in their muscle memory, sitting on rocks in the cold, watching light move on water and calling it beautiful not because it benefited them but because it was, in itself, specific and irreducible and real. The assessment was still open, the sentence was still suspended. The second cup of tea was still steaming on the edge of the console. Marin sat on the rocks in the cold and looked at the light. Thank you, she thought. To no one, to the empty air, to the part of the void that had been listening since before any of this started, since the first human looked up at the dark and decided to say something into it, not because anyone would answer, not because the answer was guaranteed, but because the saying was the thing. The act of opening toward what was unknown. The specific human refusal to be silent in the face of the infinite. The light moved on the water. Sev's fur held the new color. The cold held them both. They stayed.